This is sourced from a socialist publication called the Fiscal Reference Tables that's produced by the Department of Finance. The blue line is total government outlays in Canada as a share of GDP. It goes back to 1970, and you can see it's a really interesting picture of the way the public economy has developed in Canada and then has started to disappear in Canada. The blue line goes up steadily until the early 1990s and then goes down. The red line is the same number for the United States. And for me, the shock realization here is that, you know, we've been living in this bowl of hot water that's been bubbling away courtesy of Paul Martin and Mike Harris and Ralph Klein and those folks. But the sum total of what they've done has represented a really dramatic change in where that line between what's public and what's private in Canada is being drawn. The peak in the early 1990s was around 53, 54%. At the low point, just before the recession, it was down to 40. That's a huge change in what the economy is doing and the line that's been drawn between public and private. And I think it's important to keep this picture in mind for two reasons. One is because that's what actually lies behind the game of fiscal politics that's been played in Canada since the early 1990s. That's what's been going on as we've gone through this ratchet effect of, oh dear, the sky is falling, we've got to do something about the deficit. We cut public spending, then the economy produces a surplus, we give away the surplus in tax cuts, then the economy goes down again, and we say we've got to cut public services. That's the effect of that. And what it means is that fiscally on the expenditure side, and these guys have essentially turned Canada into the United States. So that's the broad picture. That's the sort of if you want, the view from outer space. So how do these? So let's sort of narrow right down to basically a couple of years ago in Ontario. How does this ratchet effect that I've been talking about work in very concrete terms? So first of all, you want to consistently exaggerate the deficit. Now here's a very busy chart, but it gives you an idea of the kind of games that people play when they produce these weighty tomes, these supposedly bulletproof estimates and projections of what's going on with the provincial budget. Every year, every fiscal year has four different hard numbers attached to it. They make a forecast 2 years ahead of time. Ontario operates on a 4-year cycle. They show you the number for the previous year. They show you the number for the current budget. They show you the number for each of the next 2 years projected. And so they project 2 years, then they project 1 year, then the actual budget happens, and then we wait for about 1.5 years, and the public accounts come out and tell you what it actually is. And you'll notice the ski hill motif that shows up here with these numbers. So, there's some partial ones here. So I'll show you the one where the whole cycle is being completed during this current fiscal scare, and that's 2011-12. In 2011-12, the 2-year forecast was for a deficit of just 19.7 billion, I think, just about 20 billion. A year later, they did another forecast, and it was down to something in the order of about 18. Then the actual budget comes out, and it's not 19, it's not 18, it's now down to around 16. These are billions we're talking about here, right? So we're not talking about fine tuning. We're actually talking about relatively large amounts of money here. And then, so then we've got the, so we've got the budget, and then we kind of fine-tune things in the off 6 months every fall. And the little purple thing here represents what they said in the fall economic statement. And then in the next budget, they have a look back. And in the next budget, they were still saying it was over 15. But then when the public accounts actually came out, it was only 13. When they were in scare the shit out of them mode, 2 years in advance, they say it's 19. And when the actual one comes out, it's 13. Now, my arithmetic tells me that that's about a 30% overstatement. And in this world, a 30% overstatement can be the difference between encouraging people into panic mode and something that looks a whole lot more normal. And the thing that's interesting about this is that this pattern is consistent. It happens every year. Happens every year. And by the way, it also happened every year in the late 1990s at the federal level as well. So there's a bit of a strategy that's involved here. So you set the context. You consistently exaggerate the deficit. Next step, 2 years ago, you validate this stuff with an imported expert. And Don Drummond puts up his hand. Every time anybody wants an imported expert to validate a right-wing opinion, Don Drummond puts up his hand. And the thing that's really cool about using a guy like Don Drummond is he actually doesn't do forecasts. What he does is he does projections. And he loves playing with compound arithmetic. Don Drummond has proved to me that people really ought to have a license to use compound arithmetic because it's really dangerous. Uses really simple straight line projections. And the thing about compound arithmetic is that if you take a number if you take any two numbers and you make one number grow more quickly than the other number, if you wait long enough, the one that's growing more quickly will get really, really big relative to the other number, no matter how big the numbers were to begin with. Right? This is just, ask anybody in grade 6 and they'll tell you that that's the way it works. So you use these straight line projections. The thing about straight line projections is that they are entirely driven by the assumptions that you make. And so I'm going to bore you a lot this morning talking about assumptions because they have really driven the context that has led us to this point in this debate. So you underestimate revenue, you overestimate program spending, you exaggerate interest costs, and most critically, you assume that nothing will be done on the revenue side of the equation. So there'll be no additional revenue generated. And then but the absolute critical thing is that it's got to add up to a headline number. And I'm convinced that before he even started, Don Drummond wanted 30, right? He went for 30. He got to 30.1. And the giveaway that he was going for north of 30 is that, well, I'll save you that. So here's Drummond. This is what Drummond projected. 2010-11, about 14 billion. 2017-18, you can see he reaches his magic number just barely, just over 30. So let's just take a look at that. So that looks pretty scary, right? That looks pretty scary. Okay, so let's add a line. One of the things that Drummond does in his forecast is he says, notwithstanding the fact that every economist that has ever looked at Ontario finances for the last 40 years has come to the conclusion that Ontario's revenue grows at roughly the rate that GDP grows, they're wrong. It doesn't grow at the same rate. It grows at 0.8% a year, lower. So in Drummond's numbers, nominal growth is about 4%, but I'm assuming that revenue is going to grow at 3.2%. And if you read the report, you will not find a justification for that 3.2%. The difference between the assumption that everybody always makes, and 3.2% is 8 billion of his 30, right? So now we're down to about 21. Next. When we on the left talk about preserving public services, we typically talk about preserving the real per capita value of public services. We say that if we're going to protect public services, that the amount of public service benefit that we get per person should be retained the same. And that's kind of usually the benchmark case that we use. That wasn't good enough for Drummond. Drummond assumed in his base case that notwithstanding all of the atmosphere around the weakening economy and everything that was going on, he assumed in his base case that public spending was going to increase at 0.5% a year faster than preserving real per capita. And that contributes another $5.6 billion to his number in 2017-18. So we're starting, the line's not starting to look a whole lot less ugly. And we're barely started here. Then he makes a really remarkable assumption. He makes the assumption that the average cost of borrowing for Ontario in 2017-18 across the whole debt will be higher than it was in 2010-11, notwithstanding the fact that the interest rates that Ontario is paying on its debt now are the lowest that it's been in the province's history. And we know that the US Federal Reserve has already promised that it's not going to raise interest rates until here. So it's clearly a ridiculous assumption. Now, I'm going to make a bit of a confession here. This will show you how really anal retentive I am. When I saw this stuff, I did the back of the envelope thing, and I thought, this doesn't make any sense. But then I actually went back, and I went into the public accounts, which actually lists every debt security that Ontario has, and tells you what the interest rate is that they're paying and when it expires. And so what did I set up? I set up a little model that said, okay, let's assume. I am. So let's assume that they let this debt expire and they replace it with debt at current interest rates. And there you get, so that adds another $4.1 billion to his 30. So now this is starting to look a whole lot less ugly than we thought it was. It's now actually not even going up anymore, and we're not finished. So the last thing, another thing that he did was, usually when you're doing short-term budgets, you put contingency amounts in because you're building the budget up from the bottom and you're not sure of the individual components. But when you're doing a long-term forecast, that's completely meaningless because everything is top-down. But Drummond just arbitrarily decided to add 1.9 billion. And one might ask the question, well, why 1.9? Why not 2? Why not 1.6? Well, the answer was that if it was 2, that's a round number. It doesn't sound like he actually thought his way through to that. And if it was 1.8 instead of if it was 1.6, guess what would have happened? It wouldn't have made 30. So, and if it was 1.8, it would have made exactly 30, which would have looked like he was cheating. So 1.9 was a great number because it got him to a 3 significant digit number, which is what he really wanted. And then the last thing is, Drummond assumed that notwithstanding all of this other stuff that was going on in the atmosphere crisis, and his own writing, which tells you, in which he says that we actually haven't gotten the increased investment out of lowering corporate income taxes that we expected to get. He assumed that notwithstanding the budget crisis, that Ontario was going to continue with its program of reducing corporate tax rates to 10%. If you put those back in again, all of a sudden, it becomes, the ski hill gets reversed. Instead of climbing up the hill, we're now skiing down it. And we're down to something in the order of about $6.4 billion. We've gone from 30 to 6.4, and we haven't changed any of his economic assumptions. We're still assuming real economic growth of only 2%. So imagine what would happen if you'd been Don Drummond and you'd done your report, and instead of this chart, you'd shown people this one. Do you think you would have been able to instill panic in the populace? Do you think you would have been able to, do you think that a government would have been able to justify the kind of ridiculous austerity measures that we're talking about here? Do you think they would have been able to justify the kind of attack on public sector wages that we're seeing here? That is just going through one. So I'm going to flip through these things because I'm running out of time, and also because they say the same thing. What all of these charts, this compares revenue forecasts, program spending, debt service costs, and contingencies amongst four different numbers. Drummond's original, what he calls his status quo scenario, which is the scary number, the pre-Drummond budget, the post-Drummond budget, and Drummond's recommendation. And the whole point of these slides, which at some point you'll be able to get, the point of these slides is just to demonstrate that between 11 and 12, Don Drummond became the Minister of Finance. And because essentially the government had a 2011 budget, and then they adopted Drummond as the 2012 budget. And they may not be doing what Drummond asked for in detail, but they certainly are buying into his scary numbers. This is one of my favorite charts. I always put this up. I think we need to remind ourselves how it is we got into, how that chart started to go down, the first one I showed, what the engine behind that was, and how we got into the mess that we're in now. This is the cumulative effect of the tax cuts that Mike Harris introduced during his term of office. And we're currently, even taking into account the introduction of the so-called health premium in the early part of McGuinty's terms, we're running at something in the order of $17 billion a year in lost revenue and counting. That's essentially, that's almost equivalent to the size of the entire elementary and secondary school system that we gave away in tax cuts. That represents the fiscal capacity that was given away. So this just shows you various paths to 2017, 18. This is Drummond's status quo number. This is what the government is currently forecasting, and this is Drummond and everybody. This is the implication of getting the right kinds of assumptions. And this little line here is of historical interest, if not anything else. Back when McGuinty took power in the early 2000s, they did the smart thing politically. They hired a former auditor to come in and tell the world that the budget actually wasn't balanced when they took office. There was actually a deficit. And given the fact that we were at virtually full employment in 2004, that suggests that the deficit that Eric Peters found of about $5.8 billion was in fact, I've got 22 seconds left, that deficit was in fact structural. In other words, this represents the most conservative approach to a measure of the fiscal capacity that we essentially had given away and should have been getting back. And you'll notice that if you put these two things together, you get yourself into surplus. So I'm going to skip through this because that's basically words that go with. So I'm going to close with a return to the chart that I put up to begin with. This is Ontario government outlays as a share of GDP in Ontario, starting in 2010-11, going to 2017-18. And this is the path that we're looking at with the government strategy, which is also the same as Drummond's strategy. And I've got two numbers out here. One is total outlays as a percentage of GDP, and the other is program spending as a percentage of GDP. And the remarkable thing about this is that the size of the public economy in Ontario, just looking at the provincial numbers alone, the size of the public economy in Ontario is projected to shrink by about 3 percentage points between now and 2017-18. In other words, back to this business, back to where I started, with where this line is being drawn, the line between what's public and what's private, the line between what is collective consumption and what is individual consumption, that line is continuing to shift downwards courtesy of this exercise. In other words, the ratchet exercise that I talked about at the beginning, we're still in the middle of it. It's still going on. They haven't quit. And we don't know what's going to happen in the United States, but if you take the budget projections to 2017-18 of the federal government and the provincial and the Ontario government, assume that Ontario is representative of the country. So if every provincial government does roughly what Ontario is doing in terms of shrinking the size of the public sector, and the federal government does what it says it's going to do, the share of the public sector's share of the economy shrinks to about 38%, down from its current level of about 42. And again, come back to the mid-1990s when this process really started in earnest, down from 54. And when you think about the fact that this number will include things that really can't be changed that much, like public pensions, for example, that are not going to change, like defense spending, like external affairs spending, like the basic mechanics of running government. The shrinkage in the contribution that the role of public consumption, of collective consumption in Canadians' living standards that's being forced onto us through this process is really quite staggering. And what's really staggering from a political and a democratic perspective is that this change, this dramatic change in the way Canadian society works, in the way things work in Ontario, has not even been really acknowledged by the governments that are doing it, much less subjected to public discussion and debate. So that's the context within which we're working. So I guess I'll leave you with two thoughts. One is that, and I think it's really appropriate that we're spending a lot of the time today talking about what the public thinks of all of this stuff, because what this is really about is constructing a political scenario that enables this continued shrinking to take place. And the second thing is it's important that if we're frogs in hot water, we got to get out of the water and look at what's going on more broadly. And that means doing some tough things. It means having the argument about fiscal capacity, because ultimately that's what's driving this. What's the engine that's making this shrinkage work is tax cuts, and the engine behind the impossibility theorems that are put in front of us about whether we can actually reverse this is about tax phobia. It's about encouraging people's unwillingness to pay for the public services that we need. So these are not easy conversations to have, but if we don't jump out of the water and recognize what's going on and see it in that context, we can't win. Thanks.